welcome to this semester's first Kroc Pot. It is our pleasure to invite to host Marc Sommers here. He is an award-winning author of 10 books, which makes me insanely jealous. I don't know why I spent like the last 6 years writing a single book. I need to like, I don't know, get on my game or something. He is an expert in youth violence and conflict and has worked for, he's been at the African Studies Center at the EU, he's been at UNICEF, he has worked for a number of international organizations over his career, continues to be a consultant, but most pertinently to us right now, has recently come out with the book, which is currently #1, I think, on Amazon's War and Peace subcategory. Which is this book called We the Young Fighters, Pop Culture, Terror, and War in Sierra Leone. He's an anthropologist, he has a PhD in anthropology, and I think is going to be able to speak really well to things that I think will resonate with many of us today. This and I alluded to it just before we started, this idea of how whether in war or in politics, we can use the notion of breaking norms and mobilizing, in this case, mobilizing pop culture icons to break norms to cause terror. And so it's just a really super fascinating book. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. It's also, I hope you don't take offense, but it's also kind of like a horrifying book in places. And it's something that's hard to look straight in the eye, and hopefully Marc will be helping us to do just that. So welcome, thank you for taking time to be here, and yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Topher. And thanks everybody for coming today. I want to thank Steve for making this happen. My hat's off to you because it's my first time in San Diego, so it's Steve sort of arranged my whole itinerary this week. Yeah, this is really exciting. And Daria, you've been great to work with getting to this point, so thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Anya.
Thank you, Anya. So, I'm just curious, before we start, do we have any Bob Marley fans in the audience? People? Okay, all right. What about Tupac? Anybody like Tupac? One guy. We're gonna say one young guy.
That's in the chat too. There's about 7 folks online.
Okay. But that's usually for Tupac. It's usually young men and nobody. And in Sierra Leone, all elders can't stand Tupac, and for reasons we'll. What about Rambo? Anybody any Rambo fans? Okay. Right. So just to give you a different sense of reality for pop culture, okay? Who do we know that's big in pop culture here? Taylor Swift. When she came out a few months ago and said, register to vote, I think in 24 hours, 35,000 people did. So pop culture figures are important, especially to young people. And this is a story about why they're so important. And it's a really deep and profound story that goes back centuries, the roots of this. It has a lot to do with what's going on today, because it has to do with deep, profound alienation for young people. And alienation is what's coursing through the Western world, and the sense of real deep disconnection and anger. So, and to give you a sense, West Africa, how different it is. So I've been doing a lot of work recently on West Africa with regards to violent extremism there, which is expanding to a degree that is incredible. And part of what makes it so incredible to me is why we aren't all talking about it, because the biggest violent extremist group is bigger than most countries there in terms of what and they're beyond sophisticated. They're so much more sophisticated than the States. and nobody's stopping them. And so, so I went to Cote d'Ivoire just over a year ago. And there's a hotel, you know, guy who's gonna take me back in the minibus back to the hotel, and so he's got my name. So we get into the minibus. He turns on his the ignition, the music comes up at the same time, Bob Marley. We drive all the way across the city, it's probably an hour. We get into the hotel lobby, what are they playing? Bob Marley. I get into the elevator to go to my room, elevator music is Bob Marley. Okay, this is not specific to Cote d'Ivoire. You can hear the same kind of, it's pretty consistent there, but you can hear this in West Africa and across Africa. Bob Marley permeates that continent. Just to give you an example, we're in a different world. And what researchers have found is that when they listen to Marley in the West, they hear different things than the rest of the world. And this is intentional. The consumer side of Marley, this has been written about, focuses on he loves peace. Okay, for underclass people around the world, peace has some conditions. It's not just like we love the status quo. It's about resistance. It's about revolution. It's about standing up for yourself and getting a peace that where it's meaningful for you. Right? So that's the twist that is inherent. Why I think people don't realize in the West. If I was doing this in Africa about Bob Marley, everybody would be like, yeah, and they'd know all the words. Okay, so what I'm going to do is my talk breaks into 4 points. So I'm going to shed light on why 3 pop culture figures have proven so popular worldwide, and why there's one particular pop culture trio that meant so much to young people in Sierra Leone. That combination was actually very common in other parts of Africa. When I've had many conversations about this in different places. But Palestinians, it's Marley and Tupac. Tupac #1, then Marley. I don't know about now, but it was for, Jesus, 15 years maybe. In Asia, Tupac not so much, Marley and Rambo to this day. Rambo's very big there. There are Rambo fighting groups in Papua New Guinea, in Aceh, in Mindanao. This is real-time stuff. So then second, I'm gonna shed light on the nature of terror-based warfare that convulsed Sierra Leone in the 1990s, including how military commanders exploited the pop culture trio for wartime purposes. And some of this, just a heads up, this is disturbing stuff. War is really uncomfortable. And this is terror-based warfare. So this is no joke. And there's some of this, just letting you know, it does get into that because it has to. And I think it's important to know that there's no way that Marley, Tupac, or indeed Sylvester Stallone would have imagined that the level of exploitation of their works could possibly happen in this way. So it's all a shock, I think, including I've been in touch with Ziggy Marley and it's quite disturbing for him. Next, I'm going to touch briefly on how young people reinterpreted their pop culture heroes to help them adapt the post-war context. It's very sophisticated interpretation. And they used the ones that were exploited for war, the same, they didn't move to other pop culture heroes. They used the same ones and reinterpreted. Or in the case of Tupac, they just emphasized different songs. And then I'll end with 3 things we can learn from this truly incredible story, which came to me. I'll tell the story of how that happened. Okay, so now I'm going to start with a story. There was a girl, teenage girl in Sierra Leone. The Sierra Leoneans had this idea, they would often start with when the war came to us, okay? And then they'd start their story, when the war came to us. And there's a chapter in the book called When the War Came to Us. What does that mean? It means that you're hearing stories that the rebels are around and you don't run away. A lot of people did. But you didn't run away. It's like, oh, it'll never come here. How could it come here? It's impossible to come here. And a lot of people had that feeling. So when the rebels finally came, because it's in the back of your mind, they might come, then they come. And you know, in a split second, you see your character exposes itself. And this is a very hard thing for people who go through war, is some people run away and forget about their children, their, you know, handicapped brother, whatever it is, they just run in terror. So this girl, I don't know the backstory, but she ran into the rainforest. So most of Sierra Leone is a carpet of rainforest. If it isn't a diamond mine or a city, or they're growing either some rice or some marijuana. So she runs into the forest and runs as far as she can, and then thinks that she's not being followed anymore, and then she stops. So think about it. Who would you think of, like what to do next? Your mother, your father, your grandparents? Maybe one of the village chiefs. Maybe there's somebody that you would refer to. Who did she think of? She asked herself, what would Rambo do? And then she did that. Tupac was mostly important to male youth, but to a degree that was absolutely profound. This is in a diamond mine, by the way. And here's something that a male youth explained to me. We were having a big talk in a music shop, you know, with cassettes and DVDs and CDs and stuff like that. And he explained to me, I like Tupac because he's a gangster, and I like the gangster lifestyle. I like the way he dresses. Tupac has killed. He was always in jail. He was in the American war, so he knows war, the American war. So that's a way of identifying, right? Tupac talks about war in Compton or wherever, West Side, East Side. What about Marley? Now Marley's in the stratosphere. Marley is an ideology. Marley is part of a religion, Rastafarian religion. Marley is a very different, has a very different connotation and reputation, and he's important for different ways. And as we can talk about, the two fit together perfectly, Marley and Tupac. So this is just an example. I heard a lot of these kinds of phrases. Bob Marley is like a messiah for us. Now, these are religious people saying this. This is not like a secular Westerner saying this. A real Messiah, like people would say, how does he know Sierra Leone? It's like he's singing about our country. He talks to us, he talks for us, about our rights, about our freedom. So that's from an ex-combatant. But again, Marley was the main thing. So I'm giving these examples to give you a sense that pop culture is global and it's interpreted locally, and you cannot predict how it's going to be locally interpreted. And so that's a big part of this. You can take it for granted everybody's hearing the same song as you are. Really? Are they? Okay, so the big three. So you have Marley is the mystical ideologue. He's a Rastafarian. It's part of it. This is religious music. It's also dance music, but it's religious music. And he empowers his followers to analyze oppression, and he wants to spark revolution. And there was a process. Everything about Marley is connected to marijuana. And I'll explain more of that. But that's why I have a picture of him with smoking a spliff, because the idea that started in the 70s with young people is, in order to understand the nature of the repression, and it was extreme, is you smoke marijuana, and then you listen to Marley. So remember, marijuana is sacramental for Rastafarians. It's not just like they smoke. It's like a Catholic when you have you go to communion for the sacraments, right? It's a sacramental religious practice to smoke marijuana. So in the case of Sierra Leone, you would smoke marijuana, listen to Marley, to reflect on how you're being repressed. What's the real situation? And that's called becoming conscious of your situation, or the process, as they would say, being conscientized. Okay, so that's Marley. And again, Marley eventually became every Sierra Leonean knows his songs to this day. And the lyrics. Marley spoke really fast. If you've heard any tracks of Marley speaking, I can't understand a lot of it. It's real Jamaican English, but when he sings, perfect diction. He sings slowly. He wants you, even revolution, you know what he's saying. And that's intentional, the perfect diction. Okay, what about Rambo? Rambo was seen here, forget about this is masculinity and this was like re-envisioning the Vietnam War. Nobody knows anything about that around the world. Well, the Vietnam side is one of the reasons why it's such an interesting movie in Asia. But for most of the world, that's not why these were the most important movies of the 1980s globally. Why was it so important? Because there was this one man who fought, in a rainforest, just like Sierra Leone rainforest, just like Mindanao rainforest. And he's on his own. He was attacked. He didn't do anything. And yet he was attacked. He says several times in the first movie, but I didn't do anything. When he rarely speaks out and defends himself. So, and he's battling against the unjust system. The key theme in the movies is that the system is against him and he's being attacked and he didn't do anything. So everything is self-defense. So there's so much that people can identify with when you're being harassed by the police all the time and so on. Okay, what about Tupac? Tupac is heroic in so many ways, okay? He's telling you, Marley's saying, here's the system of repression that you have to understand. And he also says, don't get tricked, right? Don't let him fool you or even try to school you. You've got a mind of your own. That's what Marley's trying to tell you, is you're being repressed, figure it out. And then what does Tupac say? Here's what it's like to be an underclass American. I've been trapped since birth. Whoa. How many people around the world can radiate to that? A lot. Okay? Hey, Mr. Police, can't you see there's a million motherfuckers stressing just like me? Only God can judge me. Only God can judge me. Nobody on this earth can understand what I'm going through. Only God knows what I'm going through. Pure alienation. Okay, so he's the one who's forever honest, direct, authentic, and fearless. This was a big deal being a Tupac fighter. You had to be as afraid as Tupac. And what they learned is the only way I can be fearless, I needed a lot of drugs. Because otherwise I can't be fearless like Tupac. So Tupac was on a pedestal in a different way. But the system is being described by Marley, and Tupac is describing what it's like to be in that system. So they totally go together, and that's why around the world, Tupac and Marley are always together. Ask Palestinian youth. That's how it works. Okay, so the origins of this crazy story, how do you make this up? So I'm in Gambia in 2000. I was telling Darren this last night, and I'm there for the Social Science Research Council, and we're going to the Gambia with Sierra Leonean refugees, and it's on refugees and human rights. And so we're going up country, and then nobody goes up country. It is so hot there. It's one of the hottest places I've ever been. And we're in there's a camp up there, 1,500 people, but they never see a white man. They never see anybody comes up there. And there was intense corruption with UNHCR there. So there was a lot to talk about. So I met the refugee leaders, these 4 men, and they said, come back tomorrow in order to get permission to go into the camp. They wanted to. So they had the elders or a lot of the adults in the camp to come and see me the next morning at 10 o'clock. So I show up And I'm treated like this, I'm treated like a politician. I walk in and everybody wants to shake my hand. It's like 50 people. I felt like a politician. And I was walking and I was saying, and I'm thinking to myself, what's going on here? So I sit down and I'm the only one in the chair and all the people are sitting on the ground in the dirt, in the sun, in the heat. And before I start with my questions, as I always do with refugees, I just say, how did you get to be a refugee? And people, this was in 2000, so it's about a year since Operation No Living Thing, which was the big attack on Freetown in Sierra Leone on January 6th. It was referenced as January 6th then. So I said, how did you get to be a refugee? And they start talking about the Freetown assault. And there were people on my left who jumped up, men and women, who were saying Tupac and Tupac. And I thought, what are they talking about? Did they understand the question? And then there was this old man on my right who was talking about Bob Marley. And I thought, what is Bob Marley? So everybody calmed down because they were really excited and talking at once. And that's when I learned about the Tupac groups. So what were the Tupac groups in January 6th? There were these white vans and white trucks that drove into the city. And on the side, it said California Love was painted, hit 'em up, only God can judge me. And of course, the most famous, All Eyes on Me. You guys know that song? That's the biggest song in the world for Tupac. That's like being a member of the club when you listen to it. They were wearing Tupac t-shirts, just like this guy. And so high, they barely knew who they were. And they were playing Tupac on the cassettes in the vans and pickups. They came out and started attacking civilians. And it was one of the most horrific battle events of modern history. Intentionally horrifying. What about Bob Marley, the Bob Marley groups? They came in, I didn't hear about anything painted on the sides, but most of them had dreadlocks, so you can see in the one picture, these guys have dreads. He's covering his, he's got dreads. That guy doesn't, but he's also, the shirt is the Bob Marley colors, which are the colors of the flag of Ethiopia. So the Bob Marley groups were high as kites on marijuana and God knows what else, and then they attacked. And when they took a neighborhood, then they would get their boom boxes and put on either Bob Marley music or Tupac music and then make people dance to it. So this was real stuff. So how on earth did we get here? That's what I had to figure out in this book. Like, what is going on? It took me a long time to get funding. And I mentioned that I got, when you don't get money, you can ask like for the comments, and sometimes they give them to you. And a lot of times it was, this is crazy. There's no, like the idea of original research. No, this is like, there's no basis for this. So we're not getting funding. And another thing I learned is a lot of people, a lot of academics can't stand Tupac. Tupac gets people upset, which is what he wants. He wants to get under your skin. So thanks, Tupac, but it took 5 years to get funding to be able to go back. And so I'm trying to figure out what happened. And it goes back to the years of the Atlantic slave trade. I think we forget that the era of the Atlantic slave trade has lasted a lot longer than the post-Atlantic slave trade era. So slavery ended domestically in Sierra Leone in 1929. Here it was what, 1865, right? So slave trade lasted 400 years. The first, it was the Portuguese and then mostly the British. So they would give arms to two sides in a battle for upcountry, two groups, two communities. They would give both sides guns. They would fight. Whoever was won took the other side as slaves. And then the Brits would come and they wanted the men. They didn't want the women. Now, in traditional societies, including Sierra Leone, this is very serious because as soon as you're 3, you know you're going to get married. Everybody gets married. That's part of life. And then you have to have children. That's life. And so what if there are lots and lots of women compared to very few men, particularly adult men. So there was a dramatic expansion of polygamy. Domestic slavery, enslaving women. This is socially how people figured out what to do with this very, very unusual situation. And this has been going on for centuries, right? And up came this idea of femininity as inherently dangerous, as wild. You had to control it. People were afraid of femininity, not only afraid, they were threatened by it, the powers that be. And so females had to be subordinated. Obviously, there was domestic violence very high. You were really marrying someone, a husband was really marrying somebody that was a real threat to you and your family while also being your wife. And so this started in the era of slaves. And then what about the boys? Well, somebody's got to fight. So they were press ganged into fighting. And the chiefs also had bodyguards because everybody was under threat. There were guns everywhere. And so the boys were controlled and forced to be really violent. And they were emasculated. They also made it very difficult for them to marry, easier to exploit them, right? And to control them. And as time went on, one of the words that came up to put them down as bad people was a tug. Or thug, right? A tug is how it's pronounced. Okay, so another part of the pre-war, if we get a little more recent, is the British, for 300 or 400 years, slaved a lot. And then there were these abolitionists, really heroic. There are statues to them in London today of the abolitionists, the heroic, wonderful abolitionists after all this time. And so they would take slave ships on the high seas, take all the slaves, take them to Freetown, right? Where they would be freed and they became Creoles. So this is a Creole, they're from all these different parts of Africa, and the language that they all learned to talk to each other was a Creole version of English. Why is this important? It's because it's the lingua franca in Sierra Leone. 96%, basically everybody speaks Creole. It is the main language. What is that? Why is that important to this story? It means that you can understand everything Rambo and Marley say. Tupac talks really fast, right? But you can get the important words. So everybody can understand popular culture in English. Then you had the fake states. So they found alluvial in the 20s, alluvial diamond mines. Not only some, the highest grade diamonds in the world. And so many of them, on the dirt in some areas, right? So you dug them up and there are diamond mines to this day. So there's Shaka Stevens with Kurt Waldheim, the former UN Secretary General, not very impressed with him. Stevens was a serious dictator and ran the country, forget about providing services, he wasn't interested. The government was intentionally weak. He ran a business. He and his boys ran the diamond business and intentionally kept it. So when people would say they're corrupt and the government stinks, yeah, by intention, right? So of course you have to pay bribes. Do you think you're getting paid? So this was a state that was intentionally run like a business. And then to back that up, you need violence, you need state violence. So he didn't trust the army because there were 3 attempted coups. So he created his own 2 units that were his sort of private boys. What's really important here is you could not dissent. That's actually pretty true today. But at that point, there was no peaceful dissent allowed, which means there's no interesting music, like everything was boring. that Shaka Stevens was interested in songs about the party, not the country, right? No patriotism. So, so as a young person, who do you look up to? Well, that's where another version of Sierra Leone's history comes in. So here's another way of looking at what happened in the independence era. In the late 1960s, in comes marijuana. Now, I have seen marijuana. It's technically illegal. I've seen it in Kenema behind the police station. I'm not kidding. 15 feet high. And it hit that soil, that rainforest soil, and went nuts. Not only that, it's really strong. Okay, when Marley comes in the 70s, Burning Spear, Peter Tosh, but Marley instantly became the most important, again, with a spleef. Then marijuana, which had just arrived in the country, and Marley, now you're cutting edge. You're listening to Marley, you're smoking marijuana, and you're thinking about how do we get out of this? And this is where the genesis of the rebellion actually started, was with young people in Freetown, including university students. When you had to join the main group, the Gardeners Club, it was called, at Flora Bay, the passage into membership involved Marley and marijuana, always marijuana. So in the 1980s, the first Rambo movie is 82. There were these guys that would go around Sierra Leone in pickup trucks with a generator, and I had that like a big white, sheet, I don't know, huge. And they would set up video, you could watch movies under the stars, and they would set it up and you pay a little bit of money so everybody could come in, and this was their job. And so they did it in villages, they did it in diamond mines, they did it in urban neighborhoods, they did it in the whole country. And another scholar interviewed some of them and said, yeah, all everybody ever wanted to watch was Rambo. So Rambo started to get into the brains of all young people, to the degree that when they started to be used as military training videos, which they were, all of the Rambo films, that, generator is really loud. So you can't play it when you're in a camp. So what do? You don't need to show the movie to use it as a military training video. Why is that? Because even the child soldiers, the children that you abducted, they have the movies memorized. So they could say, do you remember Rambo 1 in that scene when? And then they would, and everybody like, yeah, I remember that. And then they would use Rambo tactics. They would be trained on Rambo tactics. And then Rambo system. Rambo system was looking like him, thinking like him. It was Tupac system, Bob Marley system. Always, it was never Marley system. It was always Bob Marley system, Tupac system, and Rambo system. So, and then when the movie starts, when the war starts in 1991, that's when the first Tupac album comes out. Now imagine, you're a kid, you're a boy, and they're calling you a thug. You're a loser. Get out of here, you criminal. All right, somebody harass him, right? Nobody wants you around, ever. You're a total outcast. And you hate, it's painful to be called a thug. And you're called it every single day. Okay, even before you hear Tupac's music, look what he has tattooed on his belly. Thug life, all right? In LA, he was put down for being a thug, and Tupac's response was, yeah, I'm gonna tattoo myself, I'm gonna rap without a shirt on, bring it on. You wanna call me a thug? Guess what? I'm proud of being a thug. You made me a thug, this society, so I'm gonna be proud of it. And he has whole songs about that. He's a thug N-word, right? He is the thug. And he's gonna, if you're gonna call me that, I'm gonna own it. And he did. So before anybody in Sierra Leone heard his music, the boys, he was a hero, even before they heard his music. Because he wasn't embarrassed, he was proud of being a thug. Amazing. So an instant hero. And then his music. I mean, as I said to Daria last night, if you don't know Tupac, listen to Only God Can Judge Me. He talks about suicide, about dying early. You can hear the hospital beeps in the background in part of it because he's about to die and he's talking to the nurse. I've been trapped since birth. I've been cursed, waiting for the hearse, I think it is. He's very focused on everybody. He knows he's not gonna live long. Like who? Jesus. This stuff is deep. All eyes on me. Okay, so what happened? There's no interesting music in your country. It's illegal. There's no one to look up to, right? So there's this void for super alienated people. They're looking around for inspiration, and they find it with Bob Marley in spades. And then friendship is Tupac. Tupac is he's doing what he's going through and describes as just like what I'm going through. I love Tupac. And then Rambo, you watch him as one person with low technology fighting high technology. And the system's against him and he wins. And he didn't start it. So the shared messages, why are these three wrapped together? We're blamed, but we did nothing wrong. Those in power are exploiting us and forcing us to push back. Okay? The world is upside down. The universe is perverse. Everything's upside down. This guy, this is during the war. So he comes up to me. I didn't know. This is before I found out about Tupac. He says, "Can you take a picture of me?" He stands right there. I said, "Sure." And I'm thinking to myself, why? You know, we talked about Tupac, but little did I know. This is in '97. Okay, so terror war. This is going to start getting a little bit dark. The terror war recipe is what I sort of figured out. This recipe is being used by the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Janim, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, AQAP, and so on and so on. And so in Asia, there's so many ones. What do? You exploit weaknesses in governance. In Sierra Leone, that was pretty easy because the government wasn't trying to govern or provide services or protection. They were harassing you and providing you nothing, next to nothing. You could leave that primary school and still not know how to read. So, and then you exploit alienated youth, which started in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. So girls and female youth were used basically, including the fighters, which there were. There were girl units that were fighting there were girl units and boy units fighting, but even all those fighters were also raped and raped and raped and raped. That was the main thing that happened to them. Boys and male youth, they're drugged, they're manipulated, and they became terror. These are captured, and almost nobody joined. So these are all abducted kids to become terror weapons. They were drugged so high. To give you an example, the water that they had to drink had marijuana in it. They boiled water and it was like light green, and that's what you drank for the small boys units, the small girls units, but actually everybody, all fighters did. When they had their one meal a day in the evening, it was cooked with marijuana. So the kids were kept constantly high. And then before they went into fight, then you had the cocaine and barbiturates, amphetamines. They would mix them up into powder and they'd go with this and then you'd inhale them. You didn't know who you are, where you were, and then off you go. So you had to terrorize civilians. That's pretty scary right by itself. As we were talking earlier, when children attack adults, that is terror in itself. You're flipping society. You're challenging it just when they came in. So one of the biggest curse phrases in the war, because we'll get to cursing later, but is you're beneath me. So that's what they would say to elders, and this terrified adults. That suddenly the boys and the girls were in charge, mostly the boys. Okay, you avoid fighting opposition forces like conventional warfare. This is what everybody does in terror-based warfare. You avoid the conventional forces because you're gonna lose. That's pretty obvious, and you're usually quite scared as a little boy, so you avoid them. You would do withdrawals. It's not called a retreat, you withdraw. And then you have to control natural resources. Now, this recipe is very common with like insurgent and violent extremist groups today. Okay, you also in Sierra Leone, you exploit pop culture icons for war. So these are some examples of Rambo fighters. Rambo movies were used as military training videos starting before the war. They trained commanders that were abducted in Liberia, Fode Sanko and Charles Taylor, and started training them using military training video, Rambo as military training videos for the commanders. And then when the war started. You guys know Commando by Schwarzenegger? Have you seen the movie?
I haven't seen it, but I know of it.
That was used as a military training video for urban warfare by the rebels. But there were Rambo fighters, Rambo groups, fierce Tupac-inspired units. Anybody heard of the West Side Boys from Sierra Leone? That's one of the militias, it was a breakaway from the AFRC, this sort of the second rebel group. It became a third rebel group, the West Side Boys. West Side Boys, that's Tupac. They shaved their heads, they had tattoos, they did the turn up, like Tupac, you roll up one of your trousers. You have, you put in tattoos, you're Tupac, you're using what? Tupac system. So, and then Marley and marijuana. Marley and marijuana, at the end of every day with the commanders, what did you do at the end of every day after you fought, whatever? Well, they sat down with the commander, listened to Bob Marley, and smoked marijuana every day. What about Fode, the leader of the rebels? What did he do? And I'm not kidding, because I asked a lot of people, every single speech, he quoted lyrics from Bob Marley like scripture. The most important song to this day around the world is Get Up, Stand Up. Stand up for your rights. And so we're being oppressed. So one woman who was a wife, quote unquote, in the war for the rebels said that, she said, you know, Marley was the grandfather of the rebellion, and Fode was the father of the rebellion. So here are a couple of examples of how they were being exploited. Exodus, movement of Ja people. Do you guys know this song? It's a very beautiful song. It's a very religious song, going back to not the motherland, okay, in Rastafarian ideas, and as well as for the rebels. It was all about boys. Nothing in the war was promised to girls. It's very extreme. If they won, girls, females got zero. It was only about males, which is like the FARC in Colombia. That's not them. Most rebel groups in the world promised to men and women, not this one. So Exodus is this beautiful song about moving back to the fatherland, Africa, as an exodus, as a religious act, okay? In the song, movement is said by Marley or the I3s, the chorus, movement 34 times, and move as an imperative 19 times. There was this commander for the rebels, nicknamed Superman. He was a Liberian, Dennis Mingo, but he was known throughout the war as Superman. And from what I can tell, he never lost, ever. He beat everybody. So before he took McKinney, how did he take McKinney? Big city in the middle of Sierra Leone. How do you take McKinney? Sent the boys in with, and probably the girls too, with boom boxes, positioned them around the city, turned it on. It had the cassette in was set up for the beginning of Exodus, turned it up full blast. When you heard that as a civilian, the order from Exodus was drop everything. You can't leave this, walk out of the city with nothing on you. If you're trying to bring out some money or anything, you're going to be killed. And they did kill people. And that's how they emptied the city, with Exodus. So that's a perversion, of course, and a real exploitation, but this is war. So what about Tupac? The one word everybody knows, is motherfucker, right? And it's a scary word. How did Tupac use motherfucker? Well, I don't know. If you listen to Hit 'Em Up, which is the scariest song I've ever heard, he starts out, the first thing he says is, I ain't got no motherfucking friends. So it's an adjective. I don't have any friends at all. And then he says, that's why I fuck your bitch, you fat motherfucker. He's talking about Biggie, right? And now he's putting somebody down. That's the most common way of using motherfucker. But then sometimes it's a compliment. He has a song called Breathin'. I'm the last motherfucker breathing. Wait a minute, in Sierra Leone, Tupac's a motherfucker? Yes, right? So it's a very complicated word. One way that Tupac, you see, by the way, he's counting his money. This guy's a hero. He's a total, or anti-hero, right? So what about if you take the term literally? Now, the rebels always took the terms literally from the ones they took. So what is it being a motherfucker? So you abduct a boy from a village, you bring him back to the military camp. You drug him so he doesn't know who he is or where he is. Take him back to that village and have him rape his mother. And then you take the boy back, and when he comes to back in the camp, you say, do you know what you did? The commander would say, you raped your mother. Now, what about that boy? Can he escape? Absolutely not. Does he have a death wish? Is he going to be like the bravest soldier you have? Probably. Right? And then once he dies, just capture some more boys. I mean, there's children everywhere. So that's the motherfucker atrocity. And yeah, terror-based warfare. So I just, one more thing about this is terror-based warfare means you don't kill a lot of people. Okay, this is not Central Africa where the focus was on exterminating your ethnic opposition. So Burundi, the war lasts almost exactly as long, 300,000 people killed. Sierra Leone, the estimates are between 10,000 and 75,000, maximum 75. Usually they say 50. Nobody's really sure. But let's say a sixth of that amount for a war just as long. Why? The point was not to kill everybody. The point was to keep most of them alive and terrorize them. That's terror. That's the purpose of terror warfare. It's a very different way of practicing war. Okay, so what happened afterwards? Well, Rambo, 2005 on Easter Sunday, we're coming back into Freetown, and it's Easter Sunday, everybody's dressed up beautifully, coming back from church. It was midday, and we looked in the video parlors, had posters like of who are they watching that day, what's showing in the video parlor. Rambo films. So entire families would go to church, and then as a treat on Easter Sunday, they'd go watch a Rambo film. Even after I've been looking at it, I still can't believe this stuff. So, but after a while, Rambo was like there are other films, he wasn't as popular. What about Tupac? Here's from a male youth talking about it, why Tupac became so important after the war as well. There are so many sufferers here. I used to hear about people who succeeded like Tupac. I'm from nowhere. How many people in the world can say that? But someday I can make it. Tupac is an example for us. That's Tupac. So he always is your friend. You always can relate to Tupac. That's the poster. So you have the Crips, right? The Bloods and the Crips. So there's a gang, and he's wearing the Nikes. He's cool, right? And here it says motto, truth, Tupac. This is the reality. That's Tupac. Don't look away. That's Tupac. So, and then what about Marley? Well, everybody knows Marley. Everybody knows his songs. And this comes from a female youth. We were talking about Marley afterwards, and she said, Marley again was giving you validation, giving you inspiration. And she said, like Bob Marley says, don't give up. When the society's putting you down, better go listen to Marley. So, what can we learn from this war? An awful lot. So one is to draw, what does a society look like if you look at it from the perspective of one of those super alienated young people? What you're gonna see is not pretty, and it's not gonna be what normally development or post-war reconstruction focuses on. All right? So, for example, what really matters in youth programming is who gets in. That's all everybody's watching. And usually, and Sierra Leone's a good, I talk about this in the post-war chapters. Only those connected to the chiefs ever get anything. So when you live in a perverse universe, what does that world look like? If you focus on that, the whole world is going to open up and give you ideas. The same for an insurgent or a violent extremist group. What are they exploiting? Where are the weaknesses? Because they find them, and never underestimate their expertise. And that's another way of saying, okay, we're going to really understand what's really going on. Okay, and then that gets to the thing that everyone knows is the main cause of these insurgencies of violent extremism is the nature of governance. And it's, if you know, they're all member states of the United Nations. It's a really touchy subject, and it's why we never really get to the heart of it. Because governance is off the table when you ask people who run these governments. But one of the things is, and I worked at the State Department for 3.5 years, is people think that like, when there's an injustice, you can get it addressed in the Ministry of Justice. What did Richard Pryor say? Oh, we know justice, just us. So we have to really see if it's run like a business, now understand it. Where are the pressure points? My goodness, you have leverage if you want to use it. Just mess with their system of extraction, right? How many American banks are facilitating money laundering around the world, including in Africa?
Everyone.
It'd be really easy to stop this, to tweak it anywhere. Easy. Anyway, so that's it. Thank you very much.
There are lots of different ways that this could go, but I'd love for us to just jump in with questions here. Do we have any way that you wanna, Mark's book is, as you can see, there's a lot there, and I think he's maybe covered probably like 3 or 4 chapters of 20 something, I don't remember. 27. So if you want him to go in a different direction as well, so yeah.
Get it going. Hi, thank you so much for this and thank you for coming. I don't know where you came from. Where did we bring you?
DC.
Oh,
He escaped.
of course he wanted to come. Direct flight now from DC.
It was
Yes,
from
just
Dulles,
started.
yeah.
Oh, no.
Lots of direct flight.
Yes. So I picked up a little bits of your research methods from some of the stories, but I would just love to hear when you got that money to go back and do the research, like what was your process for doing this?
So I'm so glad you asked that question, because when I was seconded to EGAD for the State Department, because my contract was not going to be renewed under the wisdom of Secretary Tillerson, they weren't renewing any contracts unless you were connected to a certain project. You were gone as soon as nothing was renewed. So my last assignment was a brilliant one. I was in charge. I was an advisor on research for the EGAD unit working on research that was actually just getting started. So I had to have a project, and I thought if we actually do research, because you can't even mention violent extremism in East Africa in the Horn, or you get arrested. It's violent extremists, if they're in your country, then you're talking about it, you're attacking the government, because it means the government, oh, so you think they're here? And then so I thought, if I do research, somebody's gonna get arrested. So I thought, I did this course that I was asked to teach at the Fletcher School. So I taught at the Fletcher School for 6 years, I think. And I taught this course on how to do research during and after wars. So I took, and I had to write it all, because there was almost nothing to draw from. So I created most of the material. And I took that and I said, I'll write a manual. And eventually it became a book, had to be cleared, which wasn't easy. So I'll leave this with Topher. This is my trust-based qualitative field methods. And I use it for diplomacy as well. I use it, this methods for post-war. It's not just, it says, I had to say for researchers of violent extremism, because that's why they sent me. But I've used it for 30 years, these methods. So trust-based research is based on making connections to people and using very clear, straightforward questionnaires, always asking questions that are declarative, have really simple language, easy to translate, being very transparent when people ask you questions, going to the same place, so you use snowball sampling because it builds trust. And with the recognition that every research approach has its strengths and weaknesses. It's not like it's foolproof. But in post-war environments and with ex-combatants, there isn't, in my view, I don't think anything else can work. Because what you don't, I mean, the starting point of your research, from my perspective, is, as it says in the back of the book, why should anyone tell you the truth? And then that's the starting point. And so then I try to build out from that on how to create methods that promote, give me the best chance of getting accurate information. So, East Freetown is a really tough part of the city, the toughest part of the city. West Freetown is not much better. When you go there, then I would go every day, so they'd see me. And the first day they might lie. And then the third day, then they're confessing and say, Mr. Mark, you know what, I told you, that wasn't true, that kind of thing. And then you start to get to realize how much you can say. And a foreign researcher has real advantages from a national. And I think that this has been really lost. That the best way to do research in places that are, with a real thumping government is to mix the two. So I work with local researchers always, but they're not just translators, they do interviews as well. So the person I worked with in Sierra Leone was gifted. He was the only man, I think, who ever got a degree in that country in gender studies. He was amazing. We've become very good friends. So you have to do that because there's so much that a person from the country can't say or can't ask. I can't. So you also have to start with what are your strengths and weaknesses? I'm a white man. It used to be people would really question, like in gender conferences, like you don't know anything. No, women don't talk to you. Oh, yes, they do, right? They talk to me because I'm safe to talk to, and then I can tell the village elders or the government that I sort of deliver messages for them at the end of interviews. They ask me to do that. That comes up. So we all have strengths and weaknesses. I'm just giving you an example.
Thank you.
Don't mind. So I'll leave this with Topher. It's also there's a PDF. So
Someone online has a question.
sure.
If you can hear us, go ahead and unmute and we'll see if we can hear you.
Hi, Daria. Thank you for taking my question. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, so Mark, I want to apologize. I would have come in person, but I have 2 infected root canals. And I thought that was painful, but then hearing these stories were kind of affected from the pain.
In perspective, yeah.
So just to introduce you, I'm a historian by training, but I used to work for an NGO called Child Soldiers International. And so you brought back a lot of memories. And then my specialty is ISIS. And I couldn't believe how much of what you were telling me about kind of applied to my research with ISIS. But I just wanted to say, if academics hate Tupac, I'll tell you, when I teach the World History Survey, what inspires students the most is when I tell them the story of the last Incan prince, Tupac Amaru. For them, when I make the connection between the last Incan prince and then the pop sensation that is Tupac, that's when I see their eyes sparkle with fascination. That's when they can connect to the Incans. But also Shakur is also the same Arabic root for Shakira, the Colombian singer as well. It's Shakur is to be grateful and Shakira is the one who gives thanks. So I just wanted to throw those factoids. But coming back to ISIS, I find, when I listened to this, I remembered how Rambo, Rambo in the three installments. I also teach a class on the history of drugs. So this was fascinating. History of drugs, primarily I work on psychedelics, but I mean, marijuana, of course, cannabis is quite important. But I also teach a class on history of American foreign policy through film. And it's fascinating. The first Rambo was really about PTSD. PTSD followed. The Rambo eventually became an avatar for American foreign policy when he went to Afghanistan. I mean, I think when Reagan used Rambo to send a coded message to the Soviet Union, saying, if you to the Soviets, if you've seen the film Rambo, and of course Reagan was an actor. But just to give you just another fascinating factoid, when ISIS emerged in 2014, there were rumors Stallone would come back as Rambo to fight the Islamic State. It was a rumor, but the fact that that rumor spread says a lot about, I mean, Rambo not only being kind of securitized and weaponized by these violent non-state actors, but even a global superpower still was yearning for its Rambo when it was fighting a violent non-state actor in the Middle East. So those are just my comments. I really enjoy this. I wish I could have been there in person.
Thank you very much. I was just thinking, is Rambo, how it permeates to this day, particularly in Asia today. He's quite big, but it's not surprising that ISIS would also look to him, because of course all their recruits know Rambo. Everybody knows Rambo. These are the most popular, most viewed films, I think, in the world in the 1980s. Rambo 3 was a sensation. I want to point something out about Rambo 3. Hamid is one of the stars of Rambo 3. Now think about this from the perspective of a military commander in Sierra Leone. Who's Hamid? He's a child soldier, he's an orphan boy, and he turns to a Rambo as a father figure. Well, if you're a commander and you have a lot of boys around you, what is more perfect for your training than Rambo 3? I mean, it's perfect for anybody who's in charge of child soldiers. And right, that you're obedient, you venerate your father figure. It becomes your father. I mean, Fode was really seen as a father figure by almost all the rebels. That no matter how bad it was, whatever, he was above it all. It wasn't him, it was everyone around him. That was very common. He was very popular, very charismatic. I also want to point out that during the recent election, there were lots of posters at Trump rallies of Trump as Rambo.
Yep.
So it hasn't exactly gone
Jesus
away.
as Rambo. Yeah.
What?
We're starting to see Jesus as Rambo in Christian nationalism.
Okay, Jesus is Rambo. Okay. And then even Tupac has become a religious figure. There's an article called Saint Tupac. Michael Eric Dyson, I think, has something about him as a Christ-like figure. There's an article. So they're really venerated. Yeah.
On your last point about the religious nature of how these figures and their music become symbols, and they become sort of religious gospel, so to speak. If you're thinking from a countering violent extremism perspective, the obvious answer would be, well, you got to come up with better music, right, to try to displace this, which is not going to happen. So the more important piece of that is thinking about, all religious dogmas need interpreters, right? So you need a sort of your high priests to interpret the various symbols, etc. In Sierra Leone, it's clearly the commanders were playing this high priest interpreter role, but who were some of the other interpreters of these symbols in society? And if you were trying to reverse the impact that they're having, or if you wanted to try to reinterpret that, so like Ziggy Marley, for instance, trying to reinterpret Bob as a peaceful figure. If you wanted to try to turn Tupac and Marley and I don't think Rambo, you could do that, but if you wanted to turn them into some sort of, mandarins of peace, and if you wanted to try to shift the narrative on the ground, to use these same symbols to try to undermine these groups and to try to downplay sort of child soldiers, that sort of thing. Are there other kind of, high priests of the culture wars in Sierra Leone, so to speak, that you would try to connect with or to work with? Where would be your entry points if you wanted to try to reinterpret these symbols?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's very, if I may say, that it implies a very constant theme for somebody who works on youth, that you never start with young people. They're just sitting there passively, or they have bad ideas, because boys are bad. You knew that, right? Because everywhere you go, that's Tupac. Boys are bad. So in Kigali, I asked, when I was doing research there, what are the three, the biggest rap groups in Rwanda? And the first one was KGB, which is very scary, obviously, KGB. So what's the next one? What's number two? Bad boys. Okay, plural. What's the third one? Good guy. Now wait a minute. Only one good guy, lots of bad boys? And then they explained, yes, that's our life. So and also this focus on morality, because they know that they're seen as immoral, that they're seen as bad. So who was really popular for Tanzania at that time? A guy named Mr. Nice. So the whole idea of boys particularly, and girls, right? The ones who are, unmarried mothers, they've shamed their families, have to go out of the villages. They end up, most prostitutes and commercial sex workers in Sierra Leonean cities are for quite a while, are a little bit older now, but were former rebel wives, obviously. I never knew this, but commercial sex workers that's a job where you can take your children to work. The customers don't mind. So you have this whole outcast perspective. So the answer is ask them, because young people reinterpreted Marley, Tupac, and not so much Rambo, but those two, and to refit them for their utility in post-war environments. So you don't need to go to anybody, just ask young people, and you can find out who's important to them and why. And usually it has to do with somebody who understands what it's like to be them, which is a total outcast. Before you open your mouth, everybody thinks you're horrible. To this day in Sierra Leone, people think it's the boys who caused the war, which is ridiculous. In the scholarship of the war, I put in there's 2 or 3 passages in the book where I just collected all the ways that they were described. Misfits. Oh God, I can't think of all. There's dozens of ways in English that the scholars and also the politicians, including the president then, Joseph Momo, would talk about all these horrible people, complete outcasts, like the worst of the worst. Their own people have nothing to do with them, no responsibility. Those boys caused the war. No, the idea of them being manipulated and drugged. You don't hear it. They just can't stand it to this day. And the unmarried mothers, the prostitutes, whatever. I know you're not supposed to say prostitutes, but that's what they call themselves. I'm always torn. You're supposed to say commercial sex workers, but they're still outcasts. They still have nothing. It's sad to say, but there isn't much that's been learned about this, not just in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, well, I was going to hope that you could speak a little bit to this same issue, or sort of draw a parallel to this country, where we continue to have an issue with, right, like the DNC has just done a postmortem on their unsuccessful campaign, in which, right, it went from calling people a basket of deplorables to Biden had some extemporaneous garbage. So there is this, I don't mean to just like plug you, but like your previous book was The Outcast Majority. There is this feeling that there was an outcast majority in the United States that was consistently denigrated. And now in this sort of postmortem, the DNC comes to, well, people are voting against their own best interests, which is a sort of a condescending way of saying you're stupid. You don't know what you were even voting for, you're supposed to, right? Like uninformed, whatever it is, ignorant. But there's this, there's a very similar dynamic going on though. It's difficult for those of us like in situation like in like whatever, we're almost literally in an ivory tower on a hill here, to understand, but I'd love for you to sort of like make the connection clearer for us.
Trump never criticizes his followers, never looks down on them. We love you. He's always supporting them. He validates them. He gives them inspiration. And in response, they'll do anything for him. It's not complicated. I mean, at one level, you know, alienated people are used to being pushed away. And there's now been some very interesting work, research. There was a great article in the Financial Times over the weekend about why woke backfired so incredibly badly, the whole woke approach. And what it did is it woke the movement for Black Lives Matter. Civil rights leaders were like, why Black lives? Why not everyone? All lives matter, obviously, including Blacks. But that it was always to atomize society and identify, you know, transgender have rights, Blacks have rights, and as opposed to emphasizing inclusion. So one of the reasons why people are, I think, are so angry, really angry, right, about the woke approach is because what it's saying is if you're poor and white, you're nothing because you're white. And what was that, white fragility? Like that argument that we're all whites are racist and things like that. So how the hell are you gonna win an election politically if you have these ideas? Why would anybody vote for you? You're just putting down what Nixon said was the silent majority, right? They're no longer the majority, but these are people who have problems as well. And they're not even being recognized. Their own their identities are being torn to shreds. So
You see
the Democrats are in real trouble.
you see the same, you saw the same thing during the campaign when Trump was finally, wasn't convicted, he was found, what was it, like culpable of?
Oh, the rape, the sexual assault.
Of sexual assault, and then he was also convicted as a felon, and when, and that was for like a more white collar, right, that was the hush money trial, right? But then he appears on stage in the wake of that to be like, oh, I'm a felon? Here are my felon buddies, right? Like it was like Chef G and Sleepy Hollow, like who suddenly like he's on stage with like a bunch of like rappers who've just been caught up in some like gang associate, right? Like,
Proud Boys.
like, yeah, so it's similar to what you were describing in terms of like, oh, you call me a thug, here's like, yeah, with that, like really resonates, yeah.
I'm an outlaw.
But if you go back to historically, there was a time when the primary concern was solidarity. How do you help everybody? And once you atomize it, it's basically like a jingle. I'm a bigger victim than you are. You're not as big a victim as me. And as long as you just ramp up who's the victim, because you're a certain identity group, then in the end, there's no way to bring people together around a common purpose. So there's never a common message. And David French, I think it was, had a piece about Trump rallies, which outside looked horrible and mean-spirited, but he said inside it was a celebration of people who just felt pissed off. And, you know, I have a question for you on Sierra Leone.
Please.
Because it's now 20 years, right? And I have had many contestations with colleagues at the World Bank, what was USAID, what was DFID, and then became FCDO, that the term post-conflict is a terrible term, it's a donor term. Because the country isn't out of the wounds of conflict. That the costs of the civil war in Sierra Leone and Liberia, which I know well, goes on, it's generational. When I worked in Bangladesh, it was 35 years after the War of Independence, they were still having trials of people who sided with the Pakistanis. So I think when you look at this, We the Young Fighters, one issue for me is post-conflict, well, we'll have a year or two getting people jobs, we'll do some job training, and we'll walk away. But the wounds are all still there.
So, thanks for raising that. There's something that happened in Sierra Leone. All of that's true. Things were not resolved. You know, I actually think the Germans are the best at post-conflict. They actually took on, you know, the Holocaust to some degree. Was it perfect? Of course not. But South Africa is another one that has looked at these issues, I think, fairly honestly. Sierra Leone had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Sierra Leone was based on amnesty for the rebels. And this really upset Tony Blair, so it was taken over and they had the special courts because that is unacceptable, right? These are human rights violators. These leaders have to be taken to task. And so their approach, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was thrown out and they were humiliated. There's bitterness to this day, I would imagine, to the people who were in charge, because they went across the country and they wrote volumes, and they're quoted a lot. The books are quoted a lot in my book, and did really extraordinary amount of work. And think what you want about what they did. It was just thrown out instantly because Tony Blair said this is an outrage. Why did he do that? Because he's the former colonial power. They're the ones who always get the first entree. All in the West, those are the rules. Even in Afghanistan, the Americans turned to the British for a lot of things militarily. And this is very common, Francophone West Africa. Is it possible to be more hated than the French in West Africa?
No.
I don't know.
No.
It's unbelievable how bad it is. The British has never been that bad. They never tried so hard. Anyway, so what happened is that it was taken over. The idea of justice was taken over, and it really, I think, it was humiliating for a lot of Sierra Leoneans. But the other thing that the British did is there was this thing. I don't know if you've heard of the Paramount Chiefs. So the Paramount Chiefs go back to this idea from Lord Blueguard of indirect rule in the colonial era. They were like the hippies, right? We're going to have local people be in charge. And so this started in Uganda and it was used in Sierra Leone. The problem was they had all these small groups. How do you govern through the locals? So they created this, like there'd be 5 chiefs in one area and they say one, okay, you're going to be now a paramount chief. And your position is hereditary and you're in charge of everybody else for this whole area. It's going to be called a chiefdom. And so that's how they ruled the country. There's 149 of the chiefdoms. So what happened after the war? They have total immunity. So, and they were big exploiters of young people. So what happened at the end of the war is it was chaos after the war. So the British moved very swiftly to re-empower the paramount chiefs. So intentionally, nothing was learned. The exploiters who were a major cause of the war were back in power. And then there was this insistence of, having women's representatives and youth representatives. They hadn't done anything. So that's not a happy ending, but they're lovely people. There is a democracy to some degree there that never could have existed before. So that's positive. But it's tough being a young person in Syria. Anyway, thank you very much for all your time.
Thank you.